One piece of paper, 15 years of loyalty, gone in 10 seconds tying, and nobody even looked him in the eye. The man behind the glass didn't even know his name. To him, Daniel was just a number on a spreadsheet. He'd just lost everything upend, but there was still one person waiting on him, every single day, rain or shine. Nobody paid him for this. Nobody even knew he did it. He just showed up calm, because that's who he was. He knocked on a door he'd knocked on 100 times. But this time, the man who destroyed his life answered instead.
The paper felt lighter than it should have. One sheet, one paragraph, one signature. And 15 years of Daniel Cross's life were over. If you have ever had the ground disappear beneath your feet in a single moment, stay with this story until the end, because what happens next will remind you why kindness always finds its way back to you. And if stories like this move you, hit like and subscribe now, because you will not want to miss where this one goes. Daniel had started at Halbrook Logistics as a 20-year-old warehouse hand, the kind of job nobody expects to turn into a career. But he worked harder than anyone else on the floor, learned the systems nobody else wanted to learn, and by the time he was 32, he had climbed all the way to operations supervisor, overseeing 40 employees and 3 shifts. He was proud of that climb. He had built it with his own hands, without a diploma from some fancy university, without connections, without luck. Just work. Just showing up every single day and doing the job right. That pride mattered more than ever after Daniel's wife, Marissa, passed away 3 years earlier from a sudden illness that took her in less than 4 months. One day she was laughing in their kitchen, teaching their daughter Lily how to flip pancakes, and 4 months later, Daniel was standing alone at a graveside, holding his 5-year-old daughter's hand, trying to explain something he barely understood himself. Since that day, it had been just the two of them, Daniel and Lily. A single dad raising a daughter who was now 8 years old, sharp as a whip, obsessed with dinosaurs, and utterly unaware of how many nights her father lay awake, calculating whether the paycheck would stretch to cover both rent and her school shoes. Daniel never let Lily see him struggle. He packed her lunches with little notes tucked inside. He drove her to school every morning, singing along badly to her favorite songs on the radio. He built a life that looked, from the outside, steady and whole. But the truth was that Daniel Cross was barely holding on, and the job at Halbrook Logistics was the one thing keeping the walls from caving in. So when the new corporate ownership took over Halbrook that spring, Daniel felt a flicker of unease, but he told himself it would be fine. New management always shook things up, tightened budgets, made noise about efficiency. He had survived transitions before. What he did not expect was for it to end with a man he had never even met, a CEO named Richard Voss, ordering a mass restructuring that would eliminate an entire layer of middle management, Daniel included, without so much as a conversation. The termination meeting lasted 4 minutes. A regional HR representative slid a folder across the table, thanked Daniel for his years of service, in a tone that suggested she had said the exact same words to a dozen other people that week, and told him his access badge would be deactivated by 5 o'clock. Daniel asked if there was anything he could do, any department he could transfer into, any conversation to be had. The answer was no. The decision had come from the top, from Richard Voss himself, as part of a company-wide restructuring plan designed to boost quarterly numbers before a major shareholder meeting. Daniel's 15 years did not matter. His name did not even appear on the slide the board had seen. He was a line item, a number folded into a spreadsheet labeled Workforce Optimization. He carried a cardboard box out of the building that afternoon, past co-workers who would not meet his eyes because they were afraid they might be next, and he drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. He picked Lily up from school like nothing had happened. He smiled when she told him about her science project. He did not tell her that he no longer had a job. He was not ready to say it out loud yet, because saying it out loud would make it real, and Daniel Cross was not sure he could survive it being real. There was one thing, though, that Daniel did not let his sudden unemployment interrupt, and that was his daily visit to Walter Reed. Walter lived next door, in the small house with the peeling blue paint and the wind chime that never quite stopped moving. He was 78 years old, a widower himself, with severe COPD that made even walking to the mailbox a struggle some days. Walter had no children nearby, or so Daniel believed, no family who visited, no one to notice if 3 days passed and his newspapers piled up untouched on the porch. Daniel had first knocked on Walter's door 2 years earlier, after noticing the old man collapse briefly in his front yard while trying to drag a trash can to the curb. Daniel had helped him up, made sure he was all right, and from that day on, something had simply clicked into place between them. It started small. Daniel would grab an extra gallon of milk when he did his own shopping and drop it by. He would mow Walter's lawn along with his own. Then it became daily, checking in every morning before work, again every evening after, making sure Walter had taken his medication, sitting with him for 20 minutes just to talk. Walter had been a machinist for 40 years, had a dry sense of humor, and an endless supply of stories about a life Daniel found endlessly fascinating. He talked about a son he rarely mentioned, and when he did, his voice would tighten in a way that told Daniel not to ask further. Daniel never pushed. He simply showed up, day after day, expecting nothing in return. It was not charity, not really, not in Daniel's mind. It felt more like family. Something Daniel, grieving his wife, and Walter, forgotten by his own blood, had built together out of necessity and quiet affection. Lily called him Grandpa Walter and drew him pictures of dinosaurs that Walter proudly displayed on his refrigerator door. Losing his job did not stop this routine. If anything, in the weeks that followed, Daniel leaned into it harder, because helping Walter was the one part of his day that still felt like it meant something, the one place where he was not failing. He spent his mornings scouring job listings, sending out resumes that vanished into silence, and calling old contacts who suddenly seemed too busy to talk. He spent his afternoons picking Lily up, helping with homework, cooking dinner from whatever was cheapest at the store. And every single evening, without fail, he walked next door with a small grocery bag, checked on Walter, and pretended, for 20 minutes, that his own world was not quietly collapsing. The savings account drained faster than Daniel expected. He had never been reckless with money, but 15 years of a steady paycheck had not prepared him for the sheer speed at which bills accumulated without one. He picked up odd jobs where he could, hauling furniture for a moving company on weekends, doing handyman work for a few dollars here and there. He sold things he did not need. He skipped meals some nights so Lily would not notice there was less on the table than there used to be. Still, he did not miss a single evening with Walter. Even on the worst days, even when he was exhausted and afraid and angry at the world, he knocked on that door. 2 months into his unemployment, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, Daniel walked up Walter's driveway carrying a paper grocery bag with bread, soup, and the blood pressure medication Walter needed refilled. He knocked twice, the way he always did, and waited for the familiar shuffle of slippers against hardwood floor. Instead, the door opened to reveal a man Daniel recognized instantly, though they had never once spoken. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that had no business being in this modest little house. Richard Voss, the CEO of Hallbrook Logistics, the man whose signature had ended Daniel's career. For a long moment, neither man said a word. Daniel's mind raced through a dozen impossible explanations before Richard, looking equally startled, finally spoke. "Can I help you?" Daniel opened his mouth, but nothing coherent came out. Before he could find words, a familiar raspy voice called from inside the house. "Danny, that you? Come in, come in. Don't just stand there." Richard stepped aside, visibly confused, as Daniel walked past him into the living room he knew so well. The recliner, the oxygen tank, the wall of old photographs. Walter sat exactly where he always sat, though he looked thinner than usual, more tired. "Walter," Daniel said carefully, glancing back at Richard. "Who is this?" Walter's expression flickered with something complicated, pride mixed with old, buried shame. "This," he said slowly, "is my son, Richard." The room went silent in a way that felt heavier than any silence Daniel had ever experienced. Richard stared at Daniel, then at his father, piecing together a connection that clearly made no sense to him yet. "Dad," he said carefully, "you know this man." "Know him?" Walter let out a wheezing laugh that turned into a cough. "Richard, this young man has been coming to this house every single day for 2 years. Groceries, medicine, fixing my porch step, sitting with an old man who talks too much about a life nobody cares to hear about. He's the reason I'm still breathing some days, not that fancy doctor you keep sending me to." Richard's face shifted through several emotions at once, disbelief giving way to something rawer. He looked at Daniel properly for the first time, not as a stranger in his father's doorway, but as a person. "I'm sorry," Richard said slowly. "Have we met before?" Daniel felt his jaw tighten. There was no gentle way to say it. "We worked together, sort of. I was operations supervisor at Halbrook Logistics, until 2 months ago." 15 years, Daniel replied, keeping his voice level, though his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "I trained half your regional managers. I never missed a shift, never missed a target. And I found out I was let go from a folder handed to me by someone who'd never even shaken my hand." He paused, glancing at Walter, softening slightly for the old man's sake. "I don't say this to make things difficult. I came to bring your father his medicine, same as I do every day. I didn't know he had a son. He never mentioned your name." Walter looked down at his hands, folded in his lap, his expression suddenly heavy with years of unspoken regret. "Because there wasn't much to say," he murmured. "Richard and I haven't spoken more than a handful of times in the last 6 years. Not since his mother passed. He got busy. I got proud. We both let the silence become normal." Richard's jaw tightened, the practiced composure of a corporate executive cracking just slightly. "I call every week," he said, though the words sounded thinner than he meant them to. "You call," Walter said, not unkindly, but with the plain honesty only a father could offer his son. "This young man shows up. There's a difference, Richard." The words landed like a physical blow. Richard looked at Daniel again, seeing him now not as a name on a termination list, but as a man who had quietly done, for 2 years, what Richard himself had failed to do for his own father in 6. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy, until Walter, sensing the tension, gestured for both men to sit. "I'm an old man with bad lungs, not bad hearing," Walter said dryly. "Sit down, both of you, before I have to get up myself, and that's a production nobody wants to witness." Over the next half hour, something unusual happened. Richard, who had flown in that morning after receiving an urgent call from Walter's doctor about a concerning change in his condition, found himself sitting in his father's cramped living room, listening to Daniel describe, without any request for sympathy or reward, the small routines that had kept Walter safe and cared for. The medication schedule Daniel had memorized, the way he knew Walter needed his oxygen tank checked every evening because he sometimes forgot. The emergency contact card Daniel had taped inside the kitchen cabinet in case something happened, and Daniel was not there. Walter added his own details, describing afternoons spent teaching Daniel about old machinery, evenings when Daniel brought Lily over just so Walter would have the noise and joy of a child's laughter in his too-quiet house. Richard sat mostly silent through all of it, his executive instincts, the instincts that had made him effective and ruthless in boardrooms, entirely useless in this moment. He was a man accustomed to solving problems with resources, with money, with decisive action. But what he was witnessing was something money could not buy and decisions could not manufacture. It was simple, patient devotion, offered by a man who had every reason to walk away and none of the obligation to stay. When Daniel finally stood to leave, mindful of Lily waiting at home, Richard rose too. "Wait," he said. "Please, can we talk outside for a moment?" Daniel hesitated, glancing at Walter, who gave a small nod and followed Richard onto the porch. The evening air was cool, the sky streaked orange with the last of the sunset. "I need you to know something," Richard began, choosing his words carefully. "The restructuring wasn't something I personally reviewed line by line. I trusted my regional VP, Marcus Lund, to identify inefficiencies and present recommendations. I signed off on numbers, not names. That's not an excuse. It's a failure. A CEO who doesn't know the names of the people his decisions affect isn't running a company. He's running a spreadsheet." He exhaled slowly. "I'm going to look into exactly how your termination was decided. I owe you that much. But right now, I need to say something else. Thank you. For my father. I don't know how to repay 2 years of what you've done, but I intend to try." Daniel studied him for a long moment, still guarded, still raw from the memory of that 4-minute meeting that had ended his career. "I didn't do it for a reward," he said finally. "I did it because your father needed someone, and I happened to be the one who noticed. That's all." "I know," Richard said quietly. "That's exactly why it matters." Richard called an emergency meeting with the board. He laid out what he had found, unflinching, including his own failure to properly oversee decisions made in his name. Several board members bristled at the idea of reversing a restructuring that had already boosted the quarterly numbers investors liked. Richard did not back down. "We built this company's reputation on treating our people fairly," he said. "If we let numbers erase people, we don't deserve the loyalty we're asking for. I'm reinstating every wrongfully terminated employee identified in this review, starting with Daniel Cross. And Marcus Lund's employment is terminated effective immediately for cause." It was not an easy meeting. It cost Richard some political capital within the company. But for the first time in years, he felt like the decision reflected who he actually wanted to be, not just what the shareholders expected of him. He drove to Daniel's house himself to deliver the news, rather than sending HR or a phone call. Daniel opened the door, surprised to see him standing there, Lily peeking curiously from behind her father's leg. "I'm not here to talk business first," Richard said. "I'm here because my father would never forgive me if I let pride get in the way of doing this properly." He extended a hand. "Daniel, I'd like to offer you your position back, with full back pay for the time you were out, and a promotion to Regional Operations Director. Not as charity, because the review confirmed what I should have known from the start. You were one of the best people this company has ever had, and I let a spreadsheet tell me otherwise." Daniel looked at the outstretched hand for a long moment. Lily tugged gently at his sleeve. "Daddy, who's that?" Daniel crouched down slightly. "This is Mr. Voss, sweetheart. He's Grandpa Walter's son." Lily's eyes widened. "You're Grandpa Walter's boy? He talks about you all the time. He has a picture of you on his fridge, right next to my dinosaurs." Something in Richard's chest tightened at that, a small, unexpected ache. He had not known his father kept a photo of him anywhere, let alone somewhere so prominent. "He does?" "Every day," Daniel confirmed quietly. "He never stopped being proud of you, Richard. He just didn't know how to say it, and I think, honestly, neither did you." Richard nodded slowly, blinking back an emotion he was not used to displaying. "I'd like to change that. Starting with actually showing up, the way you have." Daniel finally shook his hand. "Then let's start there. Not with the job. With Walter." In the months that followed, the two men, once separated by a boardroom decision that never should have happened, forged an unlikely friendship built on that porch, that door, that single stunned moment of recognition. Richard began visiting his father every week without fail, sometimes bringing Daniel and Lily along, the four of them sharing dinners in that small living room that slowly filled with more laughter than it had known in years. Walter's health stabilized once he had consistent family support and no longer had to rely on Daniel alone, though Daniel never once stopping by, because by then, Walter was not an obligation. He was family, and family does not clock out. Daniel returned to Halbrook Logistics in his new role, using his position to advocate for the very employees who had once feared for their own jobs during the restructuring, ensuring that no decision affecting a person's livelihood would ever again be made without knowing that person's name. Richard, for his part, began instituting a policy that required every major workforce decision to include a personal review, not just of numbers, but of the actual people behind them. He credited the change publicly, more than once, to a single dad who had knocked on his father's door with nothing but a bag of groceries and no idea it would change 3 lives forever. Years later, Lily would tell the story at school for a project about kindness, describing how her father lost his job but never once stopped showing up for someone who needed him, and how that one small, unglamorous act of daily devotion eventually opened a door, quite literally, to a second chance none of them saw coming. The teacher asked her what the moral of the story was, and Lily, without hesitation, said exactly what her father had told her the night it all began to make sense. "You don't help people because you're hoping something good happens back. You help people because it's the right thing to do. But sometimes, the good things happen anyway." If this story moved you even a little, remember that the smallest, quietest acts of kindness are often the ones that change everything. Like this video, subscribe for more stories like Daniel's, and share it with someone who needs the reminder today that showing up still matters.